a real pleasure to be back here at the IFS Green Budget. I think the venue is the same as the last time I was here as an IFS staff member, but the headsets are definitely a little more pop star-like than they were back then. So the presentation I'm going to give focuses on the material in Chapter 7 of this year's Green Budget, which was co-authored with some of my colleagues at the Institute for Government. And in this chapter, we look at how and why domestic policy has languished over the last 3 years, and what the new government might be able to do to make a bit more progress on the domestic policy agenda where Theresa May failed. Theresa May initially had quite big ambitions for domestic policy, and you'll probably remember her standing on the steps of Downing Street talking about tackling burning injustices. But she was forced to abandon many of those following the loss of her majority at the 2017 election. You'll remember that the plans to reform the funding of social care were infamously dropped during the election campaign itself, but other plans, such as to cut pensioner benefits, were dropped in order to secure a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, and some other manifesto proposals, such as on the expansion of grammar schools, just failed to materialise. And as this chart shows, before the 2017 election, the Conservatives had a working majority of 16 in Parliament. That fell to a working majority of 13, even including the DUP, immediately after the election. And the majority was further eroded earlier this year when 4 Tory MPs resigned the whip in discontent over Brexit. Oops. So the combination of a minority government plus disagreements over Brexit, which led to a breakdown of party discipline, meant that Theresa May suffered numerous parliamentary defeats, and that's particularly been the case in 2019. And it wasn't solely on Brexit legislation where this became a problem, because MPs started targeting non-Brexit legislation, both to express discontent with the government's approach on Brexit or to try and force the government's hand on no deal. And as a result, Theresa May increasingly tried to limit the amount of legislation that actually went to Parliament, so trying to do things through non-parliamentary processes instead. If you look at how many bills were passed under Theresa May between the 2017 election and when she stepped down, there were 51 bills that received royal assent in total, which is actually only slightly slower pace of legislation than had been typical over previous sessions. But if you look at the types of legislation that were passed, they were of a different nature than you might have expected from a new Prime Minister. 23 related either to exiting the EU, or were routine money bills, or related to Northern Ireland that were needed in the absence of a government instalment. And of the remaining 28, most of those were focused on quite narrow policy issues rather than widespread reform. And because of this, while you might have thought that Brexit and debate of Brexit would have been the thing that was stopping Parliament from debating more substantive domestic policy issues, in fact, what the government ended up doing from April to June of this year was to actually try and pad out the parliamentary agenda with other things to stop MPs having to debate more substantive issues. And to give you one example of that, in June this year, the House of Commons spent 8 hours and 33 minutes debating a piece of legislation on wild animals in circuses, which works out an average of 27 minutes for each of the 19 animals in the country that would be affected by that piece of legislation. But even though Brexit wasn't the single thing that took up parliamentary time and stopped Parliament looking at domestic policy, it has been a significant drain on the time and resources available across Whitehall. It's difficult to quantify exactly what the demands have been on each of the departments, but there are a range of things you can look at to get a sense of what government departments across Whitehall have been dealing with. And this chart provides a bit of a summary of those measures. So on the y-axis here, we are ranking departments from number 1, the most affected, down on various measures of the Brexit demands that they've faced. So first, we can look at the number of Brexit-related work streams that each department has underway at any one time. And on this measure, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has been the one that's been most affected. They have 68 separate Brexit work streams going on, compared to, for example, on the right-hand side of this chart, the Department for Work and Pensions, which has 11 Brexit work streams. This isn't a perfect measure, though, because departments, it's basically up to them to decide what's a separate work stream and what is one big work stream with lots of other things going on underneath it. So an alternative measure to look at would be how much extra money departments have been given explicitly to try and help them prepare for Brexit. And on this measure, it's the Home Office that has been given the most amount of money, totaling £1.4 billion so far, to help them get ready for Brexit. Another way of looking at it could be to look at how much legislation departments have been putting forward to Parliament. On this measure, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has been putting the most legislation to Parliament related to Brexit, with 2 pieces of primary legislation and 124 statutory instruments. To help deal with this, the civil service workforce has expanded over the last few years. There are now 29,000 more civil servants than there were just prior to the Brexit vote in 2016. But not all of those people are obviously working on Brexit. Unfortunately, we don't have comprehensive evidence to know exactly whether each department has seen the increase in workforce needed to meet all of these demands. But there are certainly scattered pieces of evidence from individual departments that suggest their workforces have not increased sufficiently to deal with all of the extra demands of Brexit that they have faced. And another problem that has faced departments across Whitehall in trying to make progress on the domestic policy agenda over the last few years has been unusually rapid turnover of ministers. This chart here shows you the number of secretaries of state that each department has had since 2010, split between those under the coalition period and then the new ones who have come in since 2015. A similar picture is also true, and in fact more true in some cases when you look at the junior ministerial posts. But just to pick out a couple of examples here, the Ministry of Justice has had 7 secretaries of state and 7 different prison ministers since 2010. And the House of Commons Justice Affairs Committee has pointed out that this has been a problem and has really held up and created a lack of a coherent approach to prisons policy over recent years. Another department you can look at here is the Department for Work and Pensions. So that department had 1 Secretary of State, Ian Duncan-Smith, from 2010 to 2016, but over the last 3.5 years has had 6 different Secretaries of State, at a time when obviously they've been trying to implement deep and wide-ranging and pretty controversial reforms of the working age benefit system. This rapid ministerial turnover relates largely to Brexit, which caused Theresa May to face a very large number of resignations during her term as Prime Minister. So this chart shows you along the x-axis is the years since different Prime Ministers took office, and on the y-axis is the number of ministerial resignations that happened outside of reshuffles. So we can look at Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, and then we've got Theresa May. So for the first 2 years of Theresa May's term as Prime Minister, ministerial resignations pretty similar to her predecessors. But from sort of mid-2018 onwards, she faced a huge rise in ministerial resignations, mainly in discontent around the approach to Brexit. And as a result, she's, just far and away had more resignations by the end of her term in office than any of her predecessors, even Thatcher and Blair, who were in office for much, much longer. If we look at Boris Johnson, he's actually got off to an even worse start. He had 3 ministerial resignations in the space of 6.5 weeks in his opening period as Prime Minister. So in a sense, a slightly more inauspicious start. However, there is one sort of positive silver lining to what's happened with Boris Johnson, which is that these ministerial resignations actually reflect the reimposition of cabinet collective responsibility and cabinet discipline, which are broken down under Theresa May. So under Theresa May, ministers started openly questioning government policy, and there were widespread leaks from cabinet. That was largely because she had tried to maintain a balance of Brexit views within her cabinet. Boris Johnson has taken a different approach, which is to only appoint ministers willing to sign up to his very specific approach on progressing with Brexit. And therefore, the ministerial resignations we've seen have largely reflected ministers who felt they could no longer adhere to that line on Brexit, and therefore they resigned from the cabinet. So reflecting the positive of cabinet discipline, which ought in some other areas to help the government make progress on policy, because you have that collective responsibility within cabinet and ministers pulling in the same direction on policy. But the flip side of that more tightly focused stance on Brexit is that it has caused problems for the government in Parliament more widely. As I'm sure I don't need to tell you, Boris Johnson withdrew the whip from 21 Tory MPs who went against the government on no deal. And as a result, the government now is in parliamentary gridlock. They're 43 seats short of a parliamentary majority, and Boris Johnson lost all 7 of the opening votes in Parliament of his parliamentary career. I suspect that is unprecedented, but I haven't gone all the way back through British history on that one. So this doesn't bode terribly well for making progress on domestic policy at the moment. Although we do have greater cabinet discipline, Parliament is in gridlock, and many of the constraints that Theresa May faced remain for Boris Johnson. In particular, Brexit continues to occupy civil servants and the government's time. Boris Johnson has been clear about why he wanted to leave the option of no deal on the table, but by doing so, that does mean that more civil servants' time and attention is having to be distracted to preparing for no deal and rolling out operational centres and an extensive communications campaign that could otherwise have been spent on other priorities. And as Isabel said in her presentation before the break, the public finances actually still remain pretty tight, so it doesn't offer a lot of opportunity for the government compared to Mrs. May's government. But despite this, Boris Johnson has set out some pretty big ambitions for domestic policy. He has said he's going to fix the social care crisis once and for all, and has ambitions to improve the quality of schools, hospitals, and the police service, among other things. So what can he do to make progress on this agenda? Because of the very uncertain political outlook at the moment, in the chapter we've sort of split the answer to this question in two. The first part looking at what can the government do right now, given the deadlock in Parliament. And the second part of the answer is looking ahead to what could a new government, whether it's Boris Johnson at the head of a new government or somebody else at the head of a government post-election, do, assuming that that goes some way towards breaking the parliamentary deadlock. The answer to the first question comes down to understanding what can the government do without actually having to get parliamentary approval, or what do they need parliamentary approval for. And on this section of the chapter, I'm extremely grateful to colleagues at the IFG and to a couple of the House of Commons clerks for helping us to decode all of the House of Commons rules on these subjects. There's quite a lot of detail on that in the chapter, but I'll just focus on a few headline points here. First, and this is not in the chapter because it happened after the print deadline, having been in and then taken out, and then it ought to have gone back in again, the government can't entirely avoid facing Parliament over the next few weeks, because having prorogued Parliament for a second time, Boris Johnson will have to have a Queen's speech on the 14th of October. That offers him the opportunity to set out his bold, ambitious programme for government, but also provides the opportunity for opposition MPs to table amendments or potentially vote down that address in its entirety. But to come on to other aspects of policy making, and since this is the Green Budget, I guess the important question is the government likely to have an actual budget, and what would be the pros and cons of doing that? There are perhaps 3 reasons why the government might want to have a budget in the near future. The first is that the government needs a budget and a subsequent finance bill in order to make most changes to taxation. Secondly, sometime between now and the end of April, the government does have to pass a finance bill, because without that, 2 major taxes, which are classed as temporary, would cease to operate, and the government wouldn't be able to collect them. Those 2 temporary taxes, they may surprise you they are temporary, are income tax and corporation tax. So without that legislation, the government wouldn't be able to collect huge chunks of revenue. The third reason that the government might want to have some form of budget fiscal statement is that the Office of Budget Responsibility is required to publish 2 updated fiscal and economic forecasts between now and the end of March, because they haven't published any during this financial year so far. Given those forecasts may well show a weaker economic outlook, as Isabel was alluding to in the first presentation, given that other forecasters like the Bank of England have downgraded their forecasts since March, the government may feel that it wanted to respond with fiscal policy at the time that those updated forecasts are published, although they don't actually need to. They could just let the forecast be put out on their own. So what does the government have to do if it wants to have a budget? Firstly, a budget has to be followed by 4 days of debate in Parliament. Now, our careful reading and attempting to decode parliamentary rules suggests that if the government doesn't want to make any immediate tax changes, then technically speaking, those 4 days of debate don't need to happen right after the budget statement has been laid in Parliament. However, that would be very unusual and might look a bit odd, but it would be possible. There are a small number of tax changes that the government can make without having a budget or finance bill, and perhaps most importantly in the current circumstances, the government can change the rate of VAT through secondary legislation rather than through primary legislation. So if the government wanted, for example, to do a temporary VAT cut as a stimulus to the economy, they could do that through secondary legislation, and that's exactly what happened in 2008 when the last time that was implemented. On the spending side, there are some changes to benefits that require primary legislation, but many can be made through secondary legislation, including changes to lots of the parameters in universal credit. On spending plans more broadly, MPs have less opportunity to block the government than they do on tax. So spending totals do need to be approved by Parliament in advance of a financial year, but that can wait until just before the next financial year. But they only have to be approved for 1 year ahead. So that was why Sajid Javid was able to stand up in September and announce long-term commitments on major areas of public service spending like the NHS and schools, but without immediately facing any sort of parliamentary debate or vote on those proposals. And indeed, the committed spending for the NHS and schools won't, for years beyond 2020, won't actually be put to Parliament until subsequent financial years. And even when the government does come to table supply bills to approve next year's spending, MPs have only quite limited options to try and amend or vote down those proposals. And we saw earlier this summer an attempt by Margaret Beckett and Dominic Grieve to amend the main estimates bill, which failed because the amendment they tried to table just wasn't chosen for debate by the Speaker. But if we roll forward, and since there does seem to be quite a high likelihood of election over the coming months, who knows exactly when, that could break the parliamentary deadlock in one way or another. But even if it did, there is no guarantee that it's suddenly going to become easy for the government to make progress on domestic policy. In particular, whether the UK leaves the EU with or without a deal, or indeed doesn't yet leave under any terms, it is going to continue to take up time and resources of civil servants and ministers working out the next stages of the UK's exit from the EU. And in particular, negotiating a new trade deal with the EU will be more difficult than negotiating the withdrawal agreement has been over the last 3 years, because those negotiations with the EU, once you're a third country, happen on a different legal basis with a more complicated process and require ratification by all 27 member states individually rather than the bloc as a whole. In addition, the topics for discussion are going to broaden out from those that have been under debate for the withdrawal agreement. So for some government departments, particularly DEFRA and BEIS, there are going to be many more detailed questions coming into the debate that haven't been looked at so far. If the UK leaves without a deal, there will be more immediate demands in setting up the systems that are needed and getting the policies up and running, which will mean that the 1,700 civil servants that have been deployed as part of Operation Yellowhammer will probably need to stay in those posts for some time. And in Parliament, disagreements about the UK's future relationship with the EU and the rest of the world that have sort of been simmering in recent years will presumably continue to be a feature of the parliamentary debate. In the face of all of this, what might the government do to try and increase its chances of actually making progress on domestic policy? In the chapter, we set out 5 recommendations. The first is to set clear and limited priorities. This would always be good advice for government, but given that the demands of Brexit are going to continue placing, it's probably more important than ever that the government doesn't try and spread itself too thinly. And there are particular areas, including things like trying to fix social care funding, where having real drive and buy-in from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor may well be needed to actually get those policies moving forwards. So limit priorities. Secondly, enforce cabinet discipline and try to avoid frequent ministerial reshuffles, to allow ministers to get on top of their briefs and to give policy areas the attention, the drive, the continuity needed to push forward. Thirdly, the government needs to be clear about its fiscal objectives. So, as Isabel set out in the first presentation, this doesn't mean that the government has to tie itself to very rigid targets for borrowing or debt that might inappropriately tie the government's hands on short-term stimulus policy. But the government does need to have some sense of the trade-offs it faces between different potential priorities on tax and spending. And at the moment, it's not clear what its objectives are for the longer-term path of the UK's public finances. As Isabel said, on the one hand, Sajid Javid says that the government is committed to and still retaining the 2% borrowing ceiling next year. On the other hand, the actions of the government since coming into place at the end of July have been simply to increase spending and use up all, if not more than all, of the fiscal headroom that they were bequeathed. So you do need some clearer sense of your fiscal objectives. Fourthly, the government so far has mainly used extra spending to signal and try to achieve its objectives on domestic policy. But spending alone doesn't guarantee that you're going to achieve the outcomes that you want. So the government does need to keep a focus on what it expects to get for that spending and how it will achieve that, whether other levers might work as well. And finally, and again related to the things that Ben and Isabel were flagging in the earlier presentations, the government does need to make space for longer-term thinking. We've known for a long time about the pressures on health, social care and pension spending, but actually many of these start to play out in quite a serious way over the 2020s. So despite the distractions of Brexit, the government does need to find space for that longer-term thinking on those key issues. So to summarise very quickly then, domestic policy under Theresa May languished, and it was hampered by the demands of Brexit, the lack of a parliamentary majority, and the breakdown of cabinet discipline and frequent ministerial turnover. Under Boris Johnson, cabinet discipline seems to have returned, but many of the other barriers, including parliamentary deadlock worsening and the continuing Brexit and fiscal challenges, will still hamper his ability to make progress on domestic policy. Even if a general election were to break a deadlock, the government is going to need to think quite carefully about how it can make progress on domestic policy, and we set out various proposals for how they might do that alongside the other demands. Thank you. I'll hand over to Stuart now.